Welcome back to the Cannabis Podcast, and today we're going to be discussing, can cannabis smokers legally own guns in the United States? What you need to know as the United States Supreme Court is set to deliberate on that question. Now, before we get into the details of this article and case, I want to say thank you for being here. I appreciate all the support. Please like, share, and subscribe. Share it with all your friends so we can beat this algorithm and get ahead of this cannabis news. Let's get into it. The Second Amendment will soon take center stage in the Supreme Court as the justices are set to weigh cannabis users' rights to bear arms. The case was brought by a Texas man who was prosecuted for violating a federal statute that bars people who use illegal drugs from gun possession. Attorneys representing the man argued that the ban was unconstitutional in its application. Both a district judge and a Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in his favor. The Department of Justice called the right to bear arms a fundamental right that is essential to ordered liberty and acknowledged that restrictions on the right posed a threat to freedoms. But the agency added there are, quote, narrow circumstances in which the government may justifiably burden that right, end quote. That's scary. The case could affect millions of people. Each year, more than 50 million American adults reported using cannabis, the most popular, I don't want to call it drug, but for this, it's the most popular drug in America, according to the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics. And around a third of Americans say they personally own a gun, though it's unclear how much overlap there is between the two groups. That's a great statistic that we should dig into a little bit further. But here's what to know what the case is about. A Texas man was found in possession of a Glock 9, around 60 grams of cannabis and 4.7 grams of cocaine after the FBI agents searched his home. Federal prosecutors then charged him with violating a federal law that prohibits firearm possession by individuals who are unlawful users or addicted to any controlled substances. Now, I have to say, they make it sound like it's only about cannabis and guns, but yet they add in the fact he was arrested for cocaine. 4.7 grams is a decent amount. It's not just a little bit of cocaine. So this isn't just about cannabis. It's about cocaine, and they're convoluting the two to make it sound like it's just about cannabis. But let's keep going. The federal statute is enforceable even in the nearly 40 states that allow for medical cannabis use and 24 that allow for its recreational use. That's because even if states move to legalize a drug, if it is designated as illegal under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, it is still illegal on the federal level. Cannabis is currently classified as a Schedule I drug, or a drug considered to pose a high risk of abuse and addiction that has no approved medical use, which we all know is absurd. And this is just outdated and challenging that statute. What the Supreme Court is considering. At issue before the Supreme Court is whether the federal statute barring gun ownership for unlawful drug users is similar enough to other historical restrictions on firearm possession. The Department of Justice, in its request for the Supreme Court to hear the case, argued that the federal statute complies with the Second Amendment because it, quote, targets a category of persons who pose a clear danger of misusing firearms, habitual users of unlawful drugs, end quote. The agency also contended that the law is analogous to historical laws that limited the rights of drunkards or people with alcohol abuse problems. That's interesting, back in the day that they used to deny people that were drunkards firearms. The federal government has also argued that the federal statute complies with the Second Amendment because it poses, quote, limited, inherently temporary restriction, one which the individual can remove at any time simply by ceasing his unlawful drug use, noting it only targets habitual users of illegal drugs. You know, it really annoys me, and I'm sure it annoys every other cannabis user when you keep just grouping us into druggies and illegal drugs and everything. Especially if you do any sort of research on the cannabis plant, you'll understand it is not a drug, and it's probably the most beneficial plant in the history of the world. But I continue. The Justice Department argues that drug users would not be subject to the law once they stop using the substances. The problem becomes, well, how do we know how much time has passed before someone is no longer considered an unlawful user? Who controls that? Is it the individual or the state? Additionally, they noted that drug users who may have been convicted under this specific federal statute will still be barred from possessing a firearm because of laws barring convicted felons from gun ownership. That's significant because it basically says not only can we define unlawful user however we want, and that could last as long as we decide, you still don't just get your rights back because you're still subject to a different statute as a convicted felon. That's crazy. And it's insane that anybody can just say you don't have rights because I determine you don't deserve them for whatever reason. Now, how will the court rule? It's unclear how the Supreme Court will rule in the case, but in the rulings thus far, lower courts have found the federal statute unconstitutional in this particular case, in which the defendant was not actively intoxicated but does habitually use cannabis. But various courts have made different determinations in other cases, pointing to a 2010 case that also concerned a cannabis user in which a federal court upheld the federal statute as lawful. This case is going to present an opportunity to expound on how loose an analogy can be in order to shore up the constitutionality of the modern law. Now, that's a lot of lawyer speak, but basically it's going to set a precedent for what cannabis users can and can't do depending on how they schedule the drug. A recent decision from the nation's highest court may provide some insight into how the justices might rule. Last year, the Supreme Court upheld a law banning individuals with domestic violence restraining orders from owning guns. Interestingly, one of the things that they relied on, or that they emphasized, was the fact that it was a temporary restriction, that he was only restricted from gun possession during the pendency of the restraining order. In that regard, the temporal limitation is going to feature in this case as well in ways in favor of upholding the law, meaning we justify its law because it's just temporary and, they can get rid of it anytime. Oral arguments in the case will be heard sometime in early 2026, though exact dates have not yet been announced. A decision will follow sometime in the summer. Now, that article is from Time Magazine. There are other articles in the AP, and you can Google it. Just Google Supreme Court Cannabis Decision, and multiple articles will pop up. We'll try to pin some of the articles in the description for you to take a look at. But this timeline, in my opinion, this is not medical, financial, or political advice, that when Trump said he's going to reschedule cannabis and then hasn't mentioned it since, he's setting the groundwork for this timeline to play out. The summer 2026 would be a couple months before the the midterms, which would happen in late 2026, November. So why, this is not my opinion, this is just political analysis from a bird's eye view, why would he do this now, or not him or anybody, why would a politician do it now when you can lay the groundwork and set yourself up for, I don't know, what he'll call a win before the midterms, and it'll make it look like he's doing something, especially when he does Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Look, I legalized it. Well, no, you didn't. You just still made it illegal, but you just made it a little bit less illegal. So, in this case, I don't own a gun. I have shotguns. Not shotguns. I have shot guns. You know what I mean? In my life, I grew up in Ohio. I don't want to take your guns, but I also don't want people, running around doing crazy stuff. Let's be smart about this. But questions arise, and when they talk about regular cannabis users, I don't think ever in this article they mentioned medical prescriptions. So if a veteran who has PTSD with no felonies and owns firearms uses medical cannabis, or someone with Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or cancer, if they regularly use cannabis, whether it's smoking, tinctures, vapes, or whatever the case may be, how are they not allowed to own a firearm just because it's a medicine? I know so many people that take pills all day, every day, that own multiple guns, and nothing happens to them when they shouldn't. So this, in my opinion, is the timeline you have from now until end of next summer. I would guess probably August or September or something. Before the August recess, they might rule on this to make it so it looks like they're a win. Now, the NRA, I don't know their current state of affairs, but I know they filed for bankruptcy a few years or whatever. But I do know that the enemy of my enemy is my friend in certain political cases. And in this case, the NRA is very powerful. The gun lobby is very powerful. And I would be surprised if they don't try to heavily influence this. I don't think they care who owns guns as long as people own them. So while there is kind of a muddy path forward and it kind of looks like they don't know what's going to happen, this would set a precedent to where they go, here's the ruling. Medical cannabis people are allowed to own firearms as long as they're not a convicted felon. And then they reschedule. And then they affirm all these, marry them all together, and then you go forward with a Schedule 3 ruling on cannabis. And then we probably won't get legal weed for like a long time because people will think we did something. But this is a fascinating development, something to keep an eye on, especially if you own firearms in a legal state. Let us know where you live. Let us know what you think about that. And this really defends medical cannabis users, and they don't ever mention medical cannabis. That really frustrates me. It just talks about cannabis users when the whole point about this is medical cannabis users. So I wanted to emphasize that and put these out there for you to keep an eye on, to track and watch the developments as they go along. It'll be a fascinating turn of events when this does happen. And be aware that next summer they are going to make a ruling on this. So prepare accordingly. Thank you very much for being here. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and beat all the algorithms with your support. We appreciate it. And until next time, stay blessed and don't forget to tip your bud tenders.